Hey, welcome everybody! This is Stephan from the Great World History Book, the channel on which I post lectures on the great time periods and the great characters from world history. And today I got something very special for you planned, for we're going to talk about the early alchemists, the beginning of the modern science of chemistry, and I'll promise you it's going to be a very curious tale. So let's dig right in. Alchemy is an ancient science, or perhaps it's better called a proto-science or a precursor to science, going back to at least Hellenized Egypt. Hellenized Egypt refers to the period in Egypt after the conquering of Alexander the Great. And alchemy appeared there around the 1st century AD. From the start, the main objective of alchemy in the first text that we find, the main objective was the creation of a magical legendary substance that could turn base metals, low form metals like iron and lead, into the noblest of all metals, namely gold. Only in the 7th century did this legendary substance get the name the Philosopher's Stone. So why should we study alchemy in the first place? First of all, curiously, the whole point was the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Many alchemists claimed to be able to create such a stone, but all these claims are obviously false. It is impossible to make such a stone. So why would we study this in the first place? Well, first of all, by trying to create that stone, alchemists did make many discoveries along the way that are now still important to modern chemistry. For instance, they discovered many separation methods, many new chemicals, and various chemical reactions that are now daily used in modern chemistry. But there's another reason. How can it be that some of the greatest minds of humanity, for a period of 1500 years, spent many hours in the lab trying to create this stone? This is even true for the great scientist Isaac Newton and for Robert Boyle. They both were convinced that the stone existed, not based on actual evidence. They didn't ever hold a stone in their hand, but only based on vague promises in the authoritative alchemical texts of the past. Well, how could they believe this without evidence? Well, this has something to do with the scientific method. Before the 17th century, there was no scientific method, and therefore there was no easy way to distinguish between magical stories and fantasies and actual empirical fact. The scientific method only appeared in the 17th century, and Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle actually did a lot to popularize this scientific method, and they used it in their work. Yet they still had one lag in the magical world and one lag in the modern scientific world. And it would therefore take a few decades more, so a few decades after Newton's life, that the whole hoax of alchemy finally started to collapse, and alchemy ended as a profession that was taken seriously. So it's very important as a case study of how humanity used to think without a scientific method, how even the greatest of minds could be persuaded by what now seems to be a very clear hoax. So it's very interesting in philosophy of science as well. There's one other reason from psychology, and that one is a bit more controversial. According to the great psychologist Carl Jung, alchemy, since it is a hoax, was instead interesting to study because it gave an insight in the workings of the human mind. Since the stone does not exist, the complex theories of alchemy and the mythological symbolisms and imagery that we'll see later on in this lecture must have been just products of the human imagination. So perhaps we can use the rich, dreamlike symbolism of alchemy to understand the mind. Jung hypothesized that alchemy had been some kind of a public dream, and therefore could give insight into the dreamlike substrate hidden in what he called our collective unconscious, sort of the instinctual part of our brain that we share with every other human being. Well, this was a very interesting idea, but unfortunately we didn't get very far with it. it seems like we need a deeper understanding of the brain and of dreams and the meaning and purpose of dream symbolism before we can actually say that this hypothesis of Carl Jung is either confirmed or rejected. Until that time, we'll just have to wait. It's just an hypothesis floating out there somewhere, but a very interesting one indeed. So let's look at some of the imagery and you'll see what I mean with the dreamlike character of that symbolism that they used for the creation of the stone. Here we see a dragon. The dragon in alchemy often represents the god Mercury. And in his dragon form, he represents the base metals, the basic low substances out of which the philosopher's stone will later be made. He's placed in a fire. The fire is of course a furnace of the alchemists. So this is the beginning of the transition of base metals into gold. But why this mythological symbolism? Here's another example. We see the same dragon about to devour the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon we often see in this imagery and we read about them in the text. They seem to represent some substances. It would make sense if the sun was gold and the moon was silver, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that the sun and the moon symbolize the original substances that alchemists started with in order to create the stone. And below the dragon we see either like the base substance with which we begin the process or the philosopher's stone. It's not clear from the text which one it is. But this is a common image that we find in many of these alchemical texts. These beautiful images are mostly from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, so they're quite late actually. But they're the most beautiful one and interesting one and mysterious ones. So you'd understand why a psychologist might be interested in imagery like this. So here we see the sun with wings sitting in a bath, which seems to represent like the crucible of the alchemist. And we see the moon in the form of a goddess. We see the moon on top of her head trying to kill the sun for some reason. That must present some kind of chemical reaction or something between that sun substance and the moon substance. Here we see again the sun and the moon represented as a king and a queen. They're together in a bath and we see some kind of substance, some kind of fluid streaming out of their bath. It must be some kind of product that the alchemists were trying to produce. So very mysterious. Well, now go back to the very beginning. The earliest known text about alchemy was written by a man called Zosimas around 300 AD in, as I've told you before, Hellenized Egypt. But in the text, Zosimas already makes references to earlier works, so we know that Zosimas wasn't the first alchemist. There were alchemists before, but we just don't have those texts anymore. Zosimas also gives us the earliest mention of the word chemia, or chemistry, likely related to the Greek word cheo, which means to melt. Zosimas hypothesized that all matter in the universe was combined of a body, which he called soma, and a spirit, which he called pneuma. And both the body and the spirit, he believed, in some processes could be separated by fire, by the alchemist. The body, he believed, was identical in all types of matter. So for instance, in all different kinds of salts and metals and gases and so on. This is reminiscent of Aristotle's idea of prime matter. At some point I'll make a lecture about Aristotle's physics because that has been very, very influential in Western history. But Aristotle believed that all the different elements in the world have at their core, at their base, a qualityless substance called prime matter, a sort of ur-substance. And once that substance gains different quality, like wetness or hotness or dryness, etc., prime matter turns into all the elements that we see around us. Happens not to be true, but it is an interesting early idea by Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the greatest geniuses of all time. Zosimas weirdly identified this prime matter of Aristotle with the liquid metal called mercury. And here we have an image of mercury. You can see it is liquid. It's the only metal that is liquid in room temperature. So it's a very peculiar substance, and that's probably why it attracted the attention of the alchemists. But of course Zosimas didn't have a true reason why mercury should be that prime matter of all matter, but that's what he believed. Zosimas also claimed that he could himself transmute base metals into gold. but he then admitted to deliberately confuse his readers about his recipe in order to hide his secret. This was of course a very cheap tactic to hide the fact that he actually had no idea how to make such a stone. If he would have given a clear recipe, other people would have tried to copy it and would have found that no philosopher's stone could be made. So it's a cheap trick, and it is used all throughout alchemical history, and somehow lots of scientists fell for this very obvious hoax. To hide the secret, he wrote, alchemists called a single thing by many names and call many things by a single name. So they try to confuse the reader with different terms meaning different things. And obviously this was just to hide the fact that they had no idea what they were talking about. So let's look at some of these names, because they're quite interesting. One of the names for the stone was the tincture or pigment, referring to the stone's ability to change from one color, from the base metals, into a gold color. Another was xerion, medicinal powder, because it was believed that the stone could quote-unquote heal base metals into gold. Another name for the stone was the water of sulfur, which in Greek can also be read as divine water. Normally, water of sulfur referred to a substance made from heating lime, adding sulfur and urine that was used to make silver look like gold. It was used to make imitation gold. So it made sense that Zosimas used this term, for water of sulfur could at least make pretend gold. And by the way, sulfur will play an important part in our story today, so I'll show you a picture of what sulfur looks like in case you didn't know. Also a very peculiar substance. Mercury and sulfur are the main ingredients in alchemical theory. Zosimas also described a number of dreams, which he revealed to be metaphors for chemical reactions, and this we'll often see in the history of alchemy. For instance, in one dream we read that Zosimas was dismembered, burnt on an altar, until his spirit finally lifted from his body. The lifting of the spirit from the body became an often used metaphor in alchemy, being a metaphor for evaporation, some kind of gaseous substance rising up from a liquid. And here we see a relatively recent image, I guess from the 16th century, of this process. The dove stands for the soul leaving the body, but it's a metaphor for gaseous substances raising up from the liquid. In the 8th century, an Egyptian symbol known as the Oroboros, a snake eating its own tail, became part of the alchemical work. It used to be part for a long time of the Egyptian mythology, the snake eating its own tail, suggesting endless death and regeneration, and a sort of eternal cycle of life and death. The snake was an obvious choice for this, because the snake sometimes sheds his own skin and gets a sort of new chance at life. So that was a sort of mythological connotation of the Oroboros. Let's look at some of my favorite pictures. This is one of the most beautiful ones from the 17th century. This is the dragon Mercury that we've seen before, but in the shape of an Oroboros biting its own tail. Here we see one of the cutest one. I like the one at the bottom. Great, with a crown on its head. Crazy, crazy dream-like symbolism. Very interesting indeed. And here we see that first image of the Oroboros in that 8th century text. And in the middle we see Greek that we will focus on in the next slide. So the words in the middle of that first image read, quote, "The all is one," unquote. And this seems to suggest once more the existence of a prime matter, a one substance, underlying all the matter in the universe. We're not 100% sure this is the correct interpretation, but that seems to be a reasonable hypothesis, at least. So what does the snake, the Oroboros, represent in the alchemical studies? Well, that's not completely clear, to be honest. Some people think it represents the idea that chemicals like the snake can be consumed and reproduced infinitely by way of chemical reactions. You can turn one substance into another, and to another process you can change it back to its original form. So you can change chemicals around, but that underlying substance, that one prime matter, always stays the same. That seems to be the most valid hypothesis suggested thus far. After a few centuries, alchemy transferred to the Islamic world, where chemia became the word alchemia, which later turned into alchemy in the West. Al in Arabic means the, so it says something like the chemistry, alchemia, and that became one word, alchemy in the West. Similarly, the word Xerion became Ixir or al-Ixir, which in Europe finally became elixir. There's an interesting story how alchemy finally reached the Islamic realm, and it is told by the historian Ibn al-Faqih in the 10th century. And the story goes as follows, probably legendary, but it's interesting nonetheless. Ambassador Umara ibn Hamza traveled to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital Constantinople. And there the ambassador was supposedly shown storehouses filled with bags of white and red powder. The white and the red powder will become very important in later Western alchemy as well. The emperor ordered some lead to be melted, and he added a tiny bit of the white powder, which turned the lead into silver. Then he added a bit of the red powder to the molten copper, which transmuted it into gold. Well, you can understand when the ambassador returned to Baghdad, Caliph al-Mansur in the 8th century was so intrigued that he asked for the translations of various alchemical texts into Arabic. And this part actually happened. There were some texts in the 8th century translated into the Arabic language. And here we see a physician alchemist preparing an elixir in one of the old Arabic manuscripts. Very beautiful painting indeed. The most important alchemist of the Islamic world was Jabir ibn Hayan, who lived possibly in the 8th century, but his dates are very unsure. Jabir took the secrecy of Zosimas to the next level by writing in an even more grandiose, esoteric language, like he had the secret to the entire universe. He also, just like Zosimas, coded his recipes with esoteric metaphors, supposedly to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. His own master, Jafar al-Sadiq, had warned him, quote, "Reveal the knowledge as you desire, but such that none have access to it, but those who are truly worthy of it." So, a very clever trick to make the reader feel special, even though it's actually a scam, and the secrecy just means that there is no philosopher's stone to begin with. But you can imagine that the serious students of alchemy would feel pretty special, because he would feel, I'm the kind of worthy person that is going to decipher this text, and of course, never they did. Jabir became especially known for popularizing the so-called Mercury-sulfur theory of metals, which continued to have adherents until the 18th century, when the theory was finally once and for all debunked. But it is an interesting theory nonetheless, so we're going to discuss it a little bit in order to understand the thoughts of the alchemists. So what is the Mercury-sulfur theory? Well, Jabir had read about his theory in a 9th century Arabic text called the Book of the Secret of Creation, written by a man named Balinus. Well, Balinus was actually a Greek philosopher from centuries earlier, so this definitely wasn't a text by Balinus, so we call him pseudo-Balinus, someone pretending to be Balinus. The basis of this Mercury-sulfur theory went back to Aristotle. Aristotle had claimed that two exhalations emanated from the center of the earth. One had the qualities of being dry and smoky, while the other had the qualities of being wet and steamy. Underground, Aristotle claimed these exhalations were believed to condense, mixing together, forming the different metals. Of course, this is a false theory, but it was a very interesting hypothesis, because Aristotle saw that all these different metals just appeared out of nothing in the ground. How did they get there? There must be some physical process. So that's quite a sort of scientific way of thinking, although he had no evidence for this. But this was a very interesting theory at the time. Well, the alchemists took this theory a step further, unfortunately making it a little bit more bizarre. Pseudo-Belinus claimed that mercury was related to those moist exhalations and sulfur to the smoky exhalations, and different combinations of mercury and sulfur therefore would create the various metals. And just the right combination of mercury and sulfur would actually produce gold. That was the theory. And since all these metals seem to form naturally in the earth, it would make sense that it would be possible to replicate this process in the lab and to actually create gold for yourself. That was the big promise. And here we see a beautiful depiction of those two exhalations emanating from the center of the earth, combining into the different metals. And the text underneath in the original document says something like, and just like metals were produced from mercury and sulfur, that was the theory, so too can the art. And with the art they mean the alchemical art. And this refers to the process that we've just discussed, that natural process in the earth. We should be able to replicate that artificially in the lab. Quite a sensible thought, actually. But here comes a surprising twist. Remarkably, alchemists already knew that if you combined mercury and sulfur, you just get a red mineral called cinnabar, and that mineral wasn't even a metal. So how did this theory make sense, that different combinations of mercury and sulfur would turn into the different metals, even though you know exactly what happens when you combine them, and what you get isn't even a metal? But Jabir had another way out of this through his secrecy and secret languages and so on. He claimed that the words mercury and sulfur were actually just code names for some other more mysterious, esoterical, deep substances that of course he knew about, but he wouldn't reveal. And here we have an image of a cinnabar in case you've never seen the substance. The text by Pseudo-Belinus also contained the earliest copy of a very important text called the Emerald Tablet, which was probably written somewhere in the 8th century. Belinus claimed to have found the tablet made out of green stone in the hands of an ancient corpse buried in a tomb beneath the statue of a man named Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Greatest. This Hermes figure was considered to be the founder of alchemy. He's likely a legendary figure. It is believed that he lived at the time of Moses and so on. It's likely a fable. Yet, generations of alchemists were very intrigued when his name popped up, and therefore they studied this text on the Emerald Tablet for hours and hours and hours, hoping to find clues about the Philosopher's Stone. Well, the text is not as long, so let's have a read. Perhaps we'll discover the secret of the Philosopher's Stone after all. And you'll see it's not a scientific text at all. If you read it, you might not even notice it is about chemistry. So let's read. Truth, certainty, that in which there is no doubt. That which is above is from that which is below, and that which is below is from that which is above. Working the miracles of one thing, as all things were from one. Its father is the sun and its mother the moon. And here we have again that symbolism of the moon and the sun, and that was one clue that this was about the Philosopher's Stone. The its, like from the last sentence, its father, the its was believed to refer directly to the stone. Continue. The earth carried it in her belly, and the wind nourished it in her belly. As earth shall become fire, feed the earth from that which is subtle, with a great power. It ascends from the earth to the heaven and comes ruler over that which is above and that which is below. Well, I have no clue what they are talking about. Perhaps you have. Well, I want to end with the following. There were also a number of critics of alchemy that did not believe in the transmutation, and one of them was Ibn Sina. Well, Ibn Sina was a great thinker, great intellectual, and at some point I'll make a whole lecture about his life because it's totally fascinating. Ibn Sina thought the following. He denied the possibility of transmutation, for he claims that alchemists, quote, do not have the power to bring about any true change of species. You cannot really change one substance into the other, he claimed. We also read, whatever God created through natural powers cannot be imitated artificially. human industry is just not the same as what nature does. But interestingly, Ibn Sina was also wrong. A later European author already refuted his claim, since substances like salts could be made in the lab and seemed identical to the salts found in nature. So the alchemist could indeed change one substance into another. So Ibn Sina was also wrong. For instance, alchemists knew that if you combine the yellowish poisonous gas called chlorine with the malleable grey metal called sodium, you end up with normal sea salt with just exactly the same characteristics as the salt that we find in the sea. So the critics weren't correct as well. It is indeed very complicated to find truth without any systematic application of the scientific method. And that is in fact one of the morals of today's story. So we finally come to the end of this lecture, the beginnings of alchemy. In another lecture I'll look at the development of Western alchemy. And if you want to know more about alchemy or any of the great topics from world history, get my book, The Great World History Book. At this moment you can only order it at worldhistorybook.com. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, are inspired to learn more, and see you in the next lecture. Goodbye.